My name is Ethan Taylor, and that night everything changed. It started like any other family dinner. Awkward smiles, forced conversation, and the faint hum of unease between me and my new stepbrother, Caleb. But something shifted. As the evening wore on, I caught him watching me, his gaze lingering a moment too long, his words laced with a challenge I couldn't ignore. I didn't know it then, but that night marked the beginning of something neither of us could control, a forbidden bond that would unravel our lives. What started as tension would ignite into something far more dangerous. And as I sit here now, replaying every decision, every moment, I realize there was one lie that started it all, pretending we could keep our distance. Before we dive into this story of love, obsession, and the fine line between connection and destruction, remember that every story we tell matters. Sharing these voices shines a light on the complexity of human emotion and helps us better understand ourselves and each other. Thank you for being here. Let's begin. Ethan adjusted the collar of his shirt and glanced at the clock. Dinner with a new family. His father's attempt at a smooth integration after marrying Amelia loomed ahead. At 23, Ethan had grown used to a structured life. Law school, internships, and carefully planned weekends. He didn't anticipate the disruption Caleb brought. Caleb, 18 and restless, sauntered into the dining room, his presence as loud as the paint splashes on his shirt. So, what's for dinner? Corporate wisdom or another lecture on success? His voice dripped with sarcasm, a pointed jab at Ethan's polished demeanor. Maybe some respect, Ethan shot back, straightening the napkins on the table. You might learn something. Doubt it, Caleb said with a smirk, collapsing into a chair. His unruly hair and paint-streaked hands contrasted sharply with Ethan's crisp appearance. Their parents entered, blissfully unaware of the tension crackling between the boys. Amelia, warm but frazzled, poured wine while Ethan's father, a man of stern principles, shared updates on his firm. Ethan tried to tune out Caleb's muttered remarks and the subtle smirk he wore whenever he caught Ethan watching. Caleb enjoyed being a thorn in his side, Ethan thought. Or maybe he enjoyed being noticed. Later that evening, after the family dispersed, Ethan found himself in the study, seeking solace in the quiet. The room smelled of old books and wood polish, a haven from the chaos. But Caleb, predictably, invaded even this space. You're not as perfect as you pretend to be, Caleb said from the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. Ethan turned, startled but refusing to show it. What do you want, Caleb? Caleb stepped closer, his smirk fading into something unreadable. I don't buy the act. All this control. I bet you hate it. Ethan bristled. You don't know anything about me. Maybe not, Caleb said, shrugging. But I can see it. The way you look at me when you think no one's watching. The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Ethan's jaw tightened. You're imagining things. Am I? Caleb's eyes lingered on Ethan, searching for a reaction. Ethan turned away, dismissing him with a terse, "Good night, Caleb." But the pounding of his heart betrayed him. Weeks passed, and the uneasy coexistence between the stepbrothers continued. Family dinners, casual outings, and shared spaces forced them into proximity. Ethan maintained his stoic exterior, determined to ignore the subtle provocations Caleb seemed to revel in. But cracks began to form. One night, Ethan returned home late, exhausted from a grueling study session. He found Caleb in the kitchen, barefoot and illuminated by the soft glow of the fridge light. "Midnight snack?" Ethan asked, his voice tinged with weariness. "More like midnight escape," Caleb replied, setting down a glass of water. "This house feels like a cage sometimes." Ethan hesitated. There was something disarming about Caleb in moments like this, stripped of his usual bravado. "Why don't you just leave then?" Ethan asked, leaning against the counter. Caleb chuckled softly. "Easier said than done. Not all of us have a roadmap for success." The vulnerability in his voice caught Ethan off guard. For the first time, he saw past Caleb's defiance to the loneliness underneath. You're not as tough as you pretend to be, Ethan said quietly. Caleb looked up, his expression unreadable. Maybe you're not as cold as you want everyone to think. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air between them felt charged, electric. Ethan broke the gaze first, muttering something about needing sleep. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The tipping point came during a weekend family outing to a nearby lake. The day was filled with laughter and forced smiles, but tension simmered beneath the surface. Caleb seemed determined to test Ethan's limits, whether by splashing him during a swim or making pointed comments that only Ethan could decipher. By the time evening fell, Ethan had retreated to the deck overlooking the water, seeking solitude. Caleb naturally followed. Running away again? Caleb teased, dropping into the chair beside him. Ethan sighed. Do you ever stop? Nope, Caleb said with a grin, but it faltered as the silence stretched. You're always so wound up. Doesn't it get exhausting? Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the rippling water, his thoughts a tangled mess. Maybe, he admitted finally. Caleb leaned closer, his voice softer now. You don't have to be perfect all the time, you know. Ethan turned to him, his defenses slipping. And what about you? Hiding behind all that rebellion. What are you afraid of? The question hung between them, heavy and unspoken. Caleb didn't answer. Instead, he reached out, his fingers brushing against Ethan's hand. Ethan froze, his breath catching. Caleb, don't, Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible. Don't pretend you don't feel it. For a moment, neither moved. The world seemed to shrink until it was just the two of them, the weight of their unspoken connection pressing down on them. Then, as if by instinct, Ethan closed the distance. The kiss was tentative, a hesitant crossing of boundaries they both knew should remain intact. But once the line was crossed, there was no going back. When they pulled apart, the reality of what they'd done hit them like a tidal wave. Ethan stood abruptly, running a hand through his hair. This can't happen again. Caleb's expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of hurt in his eyes. Whatever you say, Ethan. Ethan left without another word, his mind racing. He knew it was wrong, unthinkable, even, but as he lay awake that night, replaying the moment over and over, he realized he was already in too deep. The forbidden bond had been formed, and there was no escaping its pull. Ethan could no longer deny it. Caleb had become an addiction. The secret moments they shared, furtive glances across the dinner table, the soft press of their fingers when no one was watching, the stolen kisses in the shadowed corners of the house, were intoxicating. But with each passing day, the thrill of secrecy curdled into something darker. It began with Caleb's growing restlessness. He was like a flame that refused to be contained, burning brighter as he sought distractions outside their fragile bubble. One evening, Ethan returned home to find Caleb sprawled across the living room couch, laughing at something on his phone. The sound grated on Ethan's nerves, a sharp reminder of Caleb's carefree nature. "What's so funny?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Caleb glanced up, his grin faltering at Ethan's expression. "Just a meme a friend sent me." "Relax, Ethan. A friend?" Ethan pressed, stepping closer. "Who?" Caleb's smirk returned, this time tinged with defiance. "Does it matter?" "Yes, it matters," Ethan snapped. The jealousy gnawed at him, a beast he couldn't tame. "You're spending too much time with these friends." Caleb sat up, his posture shifting from relaxed to defensive. "You don't get to dictate who I spend time with. We're not. This isn't a relationship, Ethan." The words cut deeper than Ethan expected. "Then what is it, Caleb? Because it feels a hell of a lot like one." Caleb didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood, brushing past Ethan as he muttered, "Maybe that's your problem, not mine." The cracks in their arrangement widened after that night. Caleb became more distant, his flirtations less frequent, his laughter more guarded. Meanwhile, Ethan's obsession deepened. He began watching Caleb more closely, tracking his movements with a paranoia he knew was irrational but couldn't control. One afternoon, Ethan spotted Caleb at a cafe with another man. From his vantage point outside, Ethan watched as Caleb laughed, his body language open and animated. The sight made Ethan's stomach churn with anger and fear. When Caleb returned home that evening, Ethan was waiting for him in the kitchen, his arms crossed. "Where were you?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. Caleb froze, his casual demeanor slipping for a moment before he forced a smile. "Ow! Why? Are we keeping tabs on each other now? Don't play games with me," Ethan said, his voice rising. "I saw you with him." Caleb's expression darkened. "And? What? Are you jealous? You don't have the right to be, Ethan. This, whatever this is, it's not exclusive. You knew that." Ethan felt the floor shift beneath him, the weight of Caleb's words suffocating. You can't treat this like it's meaningless." Caleb sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not meaningless, Ethan, but it's not something we can let consume us. This obsession you have, it's not healthy." Ethan's fist clenched. "You're the one who started this, Caleb. You're the one who made me feel." "Don't!" Caleb interrupted sharply. "Don't put this on me. You're the one who can't let go." The tension in the room was unbearable. Caleb's eyes burned with frustration, but there was something else there too. Regret, maybe even guilt. As the days turned into weeks, their interactions became a cycle of passion and conflict. They would argue, their words sharp and cutting, only to fall into each other's arms moments later, desperate to reclaim the connection they were both losing. But the more Caleb pulled away, the more Ethan clung to him, his obsession spiraling out of control. One night, after another heated argument, Caleb left the house, slamming the door behind him. Ethan sat in the silence that followed, his mind racing. He couldn't lose Caleb. Not to someone else, not to the world outside their secret. When Caleb returned hours later, smelling of alcohol and cheap cologne, Ethan confronted him in the hallway. "Where were you?" Ethan demanded, his voice trembling with barely contained anger. "Out," Caleb replied tersely, brushing past him. "With him?" Ethan pressed, grabbing Caleb's arm. Caleb yanked his arm free, his eyes blazing. "And what if I was, Ethan? What are you going to do about it?" The challenge in Caleb's voice sent Ethan over the edge. He slammed Caleb against the wall, his breath ragged. "You don't get to treat me like this. You don't get to walk away." For a moment, Caleb looked genuinely afraid. But then his expression softened, and he placed a hand on Ethan's chest. "Ethan, you're losing yourself." Ethan stepped back, his anger evaporating as quickly as it had come. Caleb's words echoed in his mind, a painful truth he couldn't ignore. The breaking point came a few days later. Caleb called Ethan to meet him at a park, neutral ground, away from the suffocating walls of their home. "I can't do this anymore," Caleb said, his voice weary. "It's too much. You're too much." Ethan's heart sank. "So what? You're just going to walk away?" Caleb nodded, his eyes filled with something Ethan couldn't quite place. Remorse, maybe, or relief. "I have to. For both our sakes." Ethan stared at him, his mind racing. He wanted to beg, to plead, but he knew it wouldn't change anything. Caleb had already made up his mind. As Caleb walked away, Ethan stood frozen, the weight of his obsession crushing him. He knew he couldn't let go. Not yet, not ever. Ethan sat alone in his car, parked a block from Caleb's new apartment. Rain streaked the windshield, the rhythmic drumming doing little to soothe the turmoil in his chest. Caleb had been gone for weeks now, slipping out of the family home and out of Ethan's reach. No texts, no late-night calls, only silence. The void left in Caleb's absence was unbearable. Ethan's days had become a haze of sleepless nights and endless questions. Who was Caleb with? Did he miss him? Did he ever really care? The thoughts twisted in Ethan's mind, feeding an obsession that no longer felt like love, but something darker and uncontrollable. One evening, Ethan spotted Caleb by chance in the city. He was laughing, his arms slung casually over the shoulders of another man. Ethan followed at a distance, his pulse hammering in his ears. The sight of Caleb so carefree, as though their relationship had meant nothing, was a knife to the gut. By the time Caleb reached his apartment, Ethan had already decided he couldn't let this go. He couldn't let Caleb forget him, pretend that what they had wasn't real. Ethan waited until the building's hallway was silent before knocking on Caleb's door. The door opened slowly, revealing a startled Caleb. "Ethan?" His voice was tinged with confusion and something else, worry. "We need to talk," Ethan said, stepping inside before Caleb could protest. "This isn't a good time," Caleb began, glancing nervously toward the hallway. "It's never a good time with you, is it?" Ethan snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. "You just run, Caleb. From me, from this, from everything." Caleb shut the door, his shoulders tense. "I don't owe you an explanation, Ethan. You need to move on." "Move on?" Ethan's voice cracked with disbelief. "After everything we've been through, you're just going to erase me?" Caleb sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "This isn't healthy. You know that. I know that. We were a mistake from the start." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. A mistake. The word echoed in his mind, shattering whatever fragile hope he'd clung to. The argument escalated quickly. Voices rose, accusations flew, and years of unspoken resentment spilled out like poison. Caleb's attempts to calm Ethan only fueled his anger. "You think you're better off without me?" Ethan shouted, his voice raw. "You think you can just walk away and forget everything?" "Forget?" Caleb's voice cracked with emotion. "I'll never forget, Ethan. But I can't keep living like this. Neither can you." Ethan stepped closer, his hands trembling. "You don't get to decide that for me. You don't get to just leave." "Ethan, stop," Caleb said, backing away. "You're scaring me?" The word stopped Ethan in his tracks. Scaring him? Was that who he had become? But as he looked at Caleb, defiant, beautiful, and unreachable, something inside him snapped. The final confrontation was a blur of emotions. Anger, despair, desperation. Ethan grabbed Caleb's arm, trying to make him listen, to make him stay. But Caleb yanked free, his voice rising in panic. "Let me go, Ethan. You're not in control of me." The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as their voices echoed. And then, in a moment of blind rage and heartbreak, Ethan shoved Caleb. It happened too fast. Caleb stumbled, his head striking the edge of the table before crumpling to the floor. Silence. Ethan stared, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. "Caleb," he whispered, dropping to his knees. Caleb didn't move. Blood pooled beneath him, vivid against the pale carpet. Panic set in. Ethan's hands trembled as he tried to shake Caleb awake, his mind racing through 1,000 scenarios. He hadn't meant for this to happen. It was an accident, a terrible, irreversible accident. For hours, Ethan sat beside Caleb's lifeless body, paralyzed by shock. The weight of what he'd done crushed him, drowning out every thought except one. He had lost Caleb forever. The days that followed were a blur. Ethan cleaned the apartment meticulously, erasing every trace of his presence. He left Caleb's phone untouched, hoping it would delay any suspicion. But guilt was a cruel companion. Every time Ethan closed his eyes, he saw Caleb's face, angry, afraid, and then still. The memories consumed him, eating away at his sanity. Ethan returned to his routine, but nothing felt real. His classmates, his father, even Amelia, all of them seemed distant, like shadows in a world that no longer held meaning. It didn't take long for the police to discover Caleb's body. A neighbor reported a strange smell coming from the apartment, and the investigation began. Ethan watched the news in silence, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. When the detectives knocked on his door a week later, Ethan knew it was over. He didn't resist as they cuffed him, his mind numb. He barely registered the questions, the accusations, the looks of disgust. In the end, Ethan confessed. He told them everything, not out of guilt or remorse, but because he couldn't live with the weight of his secrets anymore. The story ends not with a trial, but with Ethan sitting alone in his prison cell. He stares at the walls, replaying every moment of his time with Caleb. The love, the passion, the betrayal, the loss. It's all there, etched into his memory. Caleb is gone, and so is the man Ethan once was. All that remains is the shadow of what they shared and the knowledge that he destroyed the one person he couldn't live without. For Ethan, the punishment isn't the prison walls or the cold metal bars. It's the haunting realization that love, obsession, and jealousy are indistinguishable when taken to their extremes, and that some mistakes can never be undone. End of story. This section delivers a tragic and emotionally charged conclusion. It ties together the story's central themes of obsession, betrayal, and the consequences of forbidden love, providing a satisfying yet haunting resolution.